Hello, and welcome to episode 25 of Charlotte Mecklenburg History with Dan Morrill. Today is Sunday, September 6th, 2020, and I am Dan's daughter, Mary Dana, and I'm here with Dan through Zoom. Hey, Dad, how are you today?
I'm just fine, Mary Dana, and I hope everybody else is doing well on this Labor Day weekend. And play it safe, wear your mask, and social distance.
That's right, exactly. And
Yep.
I'm going to set a timer this week because last week,
Yep.
we had gone a while and we
Right.
didn't even realize it. So also, before we get started, I wanted to mention that in today's paper, and hopefully I'm going to hold it up and hopefully you guys can see it some. I know I'm little on the screen, but there's an article about the Griffin that we talked about a couple of weeks ago and what's going on with that. It's on page 17A of the Charlotte Observer today. So that's great. Right, Dad? Did we?
Absolutely. It's great to see that in the paper, and I'm always appreciative to the community, and maybe that will encourage more people to become supporters of Preserve Mecklenburg.
Right. Thank you for your support, everyone. So that's happy
Absolutely.
news that it's getting some attention. So we are finishing up our discussion about mid-century modern architecture in Charlotte this week. So, Dad, I'll let you pick up from where we left off last week.
Well, I'll just say again, I'm not an architectural historian. Susan Mayer took a lot of these pictures. You can get them on the Historic Landmarks Commission's website, which is landmarkscommission.org. And I'm not going to be able to show you everything that's mid-century modern. We'd be going on for about 4 more sessions. So with that, just a couple of reminders. Remember, we talked about the beginnings with the Bauhaus in Germany to basically merge modern technology with design. We talked about the enormous influence of Henry Kamphefner, who became the dean of the School of Design at NC State in 1948. We talked a little bit about A.G. Odell Jr., who came here in 1939, who was the most important local advocate for modernism and who certainly really encouraged the whole issue of slum clearance. And I wanted to show you that it not only affected Brooklyn or Second Ward, it also tore down most of First Ward. This picture,
oh my gosh,
made about 1970. And there's a great irony here, and I'm going to try to be as brief as possible.
Where is the First Ward area?
That's
today?
The northeast part of Uptown. It's northeast from the square.
Okay.
But the irony is that urban renewal really gave the spark for the beginning of the modern historic preservation movement. And it had to do with the fact that people realized that we were tearing all our cities down. And we were being really just indiscriminate in destroying everything. And President Lyndon Johnson, who I would say, as far as how we live our everyday lives, is the most important president of the United States since FDR, not Ronald Reagan. But Lyndon Johnson, launched what was called the Great Society Program. And that was sort of a reignition of the New Deal, the idea that government could really make a better society. Many people know about what was done in civil rights with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Of course, in terms of our everyday lives, things like Medicare, for example, all that came out of the Johnson Great Society Program. But also, the same thing was true with the modern historic preservation movement. Lyndon Johnson really was the one who made it happen. And there was a committee that he assembled in 1965 to really assess what kind of impact the federal government was having on what we call our historic built environment. That is our places and spaces and buildings that tell us about who we have been as a people. And he was really in many ways encouraged to do this by his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. She had a real interest in that. And this committee that the president appointed in 1965 issued a report which was entitled With Heritage So Rich. And the basic thrust of that report was, we got to be more careful in how we spend federal money. Because remember, it was federal money that came out of the Truman administration in 1949 that really caused all this tremendous destruction to occur. I'm not going to get into this gets real technical, but here's the president. There's Lady Bird in the background back there. He's signing what's called the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And what it did was create something called the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register of Historic Places today has well over 100,000 properties in it. And it is essentially a comprehensive list of all historic properties of local, regional, state, and national significance that the federal government ought to be real careful with. The thing is that any federal project has to say, how are we going to impact these National Register properties? And if it's going to impact it, what can we do to make that impact as little as possible? That's really what it is. The National Register of Historic Places was a countermeasure against urban renewal. Now, this man, most people don't know him at all. I knew him. I knew so many people. Robert Stipe was an attorney from the Institute of Government in Chapel Hill. He also was the director of the Department of Cultural Resources. And he, once the federal government in 1966 established the National Register, Bob Stipe led the effort to get the North Carolina General Assembly in 1972 to pass enabling legislation. In other words, legislation that told local governments, hey, if you want to, you can establish a local historic commission that will try to protect the properties in your community. And that passed in 1972. So Lyndon Johnson put it on the national level, and Robert Stipe in 1972 put it on the state level. Now, this house, it's an interesting house. It's a great modernist house. It's in the cloisters, which has several interesting structures in it. And the architect was Jack Boyd. Jack Boyd was a very good friend of mine.
Yes,
Jack
I remember
Boyd,
him.
Oh, great guy, great guy. You can see by this, he's truly a happy man. He was trained as an architect at Georgia Tech. And even though he came to Charlotte in the early 1950s, even though he was born here, he came as a professional architect to be a modernist in Louis Asbury's office. He had a great feel for preserving historic places. And he was president of the Mecklenburg Historical Association. And he brought Bob Stipe to Charlotte. Now, most people, when they thought that local communities were going to establish these commissions, they were thinking about places like Edenton or Wilmington or Newbern. You know, they were thinking about places everybody thought was historic. And Jack Boyd said, well, why don't we do it here in Charlotte? And of course, nobody had really thought about government being involved in historic preservation. And Jack Boyd thereby played a big role. Now, I played a role too.
Yeah, I was going to say.
I was at UNCC. I had a wonderful friend and colleague named Ed Prezell.
Mm-hmm.
Ed died in January of this year, and he was a great man, and I'm sorry to see him not be with us anymore. But we, through UNCC, got a grant to advocate for historic preservation. We gave talks all over this town. And UNCC sponsored a conference at the Charlotte Downtowner, which later became the Marriott, on McDowell Street. And they brought a very, very well-known figure in historic preservation named Arthur Ziegler to Charlotte. And he said in this, and let me read what he said here, but he added, the experience of other cities in trying to renovate older neighborhoods might open the minds of Charlotte planners to an alternative methods of urban renewal. So the idea was that UNCC was saying, you know, we've got these older neighborhoods. Do we want to keep doing what we've done in Brooklyn and what we're doing in First Ward? Should historic preservation play a part in that? And of course, I was out there with Ed Prezell advocating the same thing. Now, the last person that I really want to mention, well, not the last, that also played a part in bringing all this about was Jacklaiborne. Now, Jack is still with us, God bless him. And he's a great man.
Yes.
He was the associate editor of the Charlotte Observer. And he wrote an article called, a series of articles in the editorial page every Saturday called This Time and Place. And Jack was a big advocate for historic preservation. He grew up in Charlotte. He knew this town. Jack loves Charlotte. And so with all of these momentums, once Stipe opened the door to local communities, Jack Boyd, myself, UNCC generally, Ed Prezell, Jacklaiborne, began really sort of trying to build the consciousness. There were others too. I'm not suggesting we were the only other ones. There were others that were doing the same things, but certainly these were important factors in this movement. Now, the issue that really sort of rallied historic preservation was the St. Mary's Chapel of Thompson Orphanage. Many of you drive by it every day. If you go in 4th Street going uptown, you go right by it. Built in the 1890s, it's got a wonderful story in itself. Maybe someday I'll do a podcast on the Thompson Orphanage.
You should.
But this man, interestingly enough, the first African-American elected to the Charlotte City Council in the 20th century, Fred Alexander. He grew up basically in Second Ward. He grew up in an area that was close to the Thompson Orphanage, and he greatly admired that building. So he was an ally on City Council for the establishment of what became known initially as the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Properties Commission. Now, this is from the Charlotte Observer, June 6, 1973. And let's just read it. With an eye toward preserving some of the past, the Mecklenburg County Board of Commissioners and the Charlotte City Council Monday ironed out a joint ordinance creating the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Properties Commission. Now, because of a change in the law, it's now known as the Historic Landmarks Commission. But this was a whole new dimension to preservation that came about, and there's no question it was a reaction to the destruction of urban renewal. Now, I want to say something about these local governmental bodies briefly. We have two here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg now. There's also one in Davidson, but I'm going to focus on the ones in Charlotte because they basically deal with the entire county, one of them specifically. 1973, the Historic Landmarks Commission, now what's known as the Historic Landmarks Commission, was created. 1975, the Historic District Commission was created. But many people believe, well, that did the job. You know, we don't need to worry about any preservation in Charlotte anymore because of the establishment of those two commissions. And let me say up front, those two commissions do great work. I have great admiration for them. I ran one of them for 43 years, and they're good people, they're good preservationists. But I'll tell you right now, they cannot do the whole job. Now, you know, that's Murray Wisnet. Remember, he was influenced by Camp Hefner and Catalano and Nowicki, and, you know, all of those people that Buckminster Fuller and George Matsumoto, all those people at the School of Design. And you remember when we looked at one of his buildings before, we said the most important thing you need to do something innovative is to have a good client, particularly one who thinks outside the box, right?
Yes.
Well, now that guy definitely thinks outside the box.
Jack Pettis, which
That
we
is
talked
Jack
about Jack
Pettis.
Pettis
We had a new
before.
podcast on him. We used that photograph before. But Jack Pettis, he was, among the things he did, he entertained kids and was a clown. So Jack was a free thinker. Now, we've also looked at this building before. Now, I want to say something about this, and I'm trying, it's a great example of modern architecture. And I think it's an incredibly sensitive building. It's on Hill Road, 1346 Hill Road, off South Boulevard, built in 1980, designed by Murray Wisnet for Jack Pettis. The thing that really strikes me about this building is how environmentally sensitive it is. I mean, if you think about when you look at most lots from the street, and this is basically where you look at the building, you don't look at the front of the building, you look at the end of the building. And what he did by creating essentially what is called a wall building, narrow but long. Look what he did as far as saving the trees are concerned. I mean, just look at the sensitivity of this building. Now I want to talk, I'm going to promote Preserve Mecklenburg here a little bit, because here's the deal. This is not an historic landmark. It's not an historic district. Therefore, neither one of those bodies can do a thing to prevent this building from being torn down. Preserve Mecklenburg, because it's private nonprofit, can do any historic building. It can do anything. It doesn't have to worry about whether it's an historic landmark or it's in an historic district. Also, many people believe that if something is designated as an historic landmark or it's in an historic district, they think it can never be torn down. Wrong, wrong, wrong. All the owner has to do is wait a year and then they'll tear it down. Now, it is true that the local commissions do have the power to buy property. Of course, that's going to cost them money. They can also get preservation easements, which is another tool I'll talk about briefly. But it's got to be in a local historic district, or it's got to be a historic landmark. Now, I can tell you, as far as the distinctive buildings and places and spaces in Mecklenburg County, I would estimate that within those categories of being in an historic district or being a historic landmark, you're talking about a very small percentage of the properties. That's why, if you're going to have a robust movement for preservation, you have got to have a private, nonprofit real estate active group. And that's why I'm going around like an old crazy man trying to get this thing going. I mean, that's just a reality. Now, look at that. I mean,
because you've been involved in it long enough to know what it takes to save
absolutely.
these buildings.
I mean, you know, I'm fundamentally a pragmatist at heart. Now, man, Dave, you look at that. I mean, you know, that building is not. You remember how we talked about so many people want to see curb appeal? You know, this building is purposely in the background.
Yeah, I was going to say it just
It
blends
is
right in.
purposely in the background. It just blends right in. Now, right now, we are negotiating with the owner because this property is going to go up for sale. We are negotiating with the owner for us to get, and this is complicated, and I'm not going to stay on it long. We're going to have an exclusive, we're trying to get an exclusive right to buy this building. We won't buy it ourselves, we'll assign it to somebody else. But we will put a preservation easement or agreement that the buyer has to accept that will assure the preservation of this property in perpetuity. So that's why I'm so, trying to push you folks to do. Now, by the way, many people, let's talk about the National Register a minute. When somebody, I told you, Mary Dana, there are over 100,000 properties in the National Register in the United States in this territory.
Many in Mecklenburg County.
Many, many, many. Now, we talked about this building before. This is of course, the 1962 Southern Railroad Passenger Terminal, which now serves Amtrak. That is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. And over 90% of the properties that are listed in the National Register are of local significance. They get mixed up. They say, oh, national, that means nationally significant. No. It's a national list of properties primarily of local significance. And all it means is, it's not going to mean it could be torn down. Because all the federal government has to do is to say, hey, let's think about this before we do something that's going to hurt that building. Maybe we need to tear it down anyway because the competing interest is too important. But at least it means they have to take it into account in their planning. All right. Now, I've said my piece. All right.
I do want to mention one thing before we move on that it made me think about that, when I was a little girl in the 70s, I remember the first project I remember you working on was Fourth Ward and revitalizing Fourth Ward. And it's interesting to see the difference between what happened to Second Ward and what happened with Fourth Ward. And Fourth Ward was also, I think, renewed, but in a very different way.
And Odell did a plan for Fourth Ward that was going to tear down everything.
Well, and then but that it went a different direction, and I'd like for you for one of the podcasts sometime to talk about Fourth Ward and what happened there. Right. That would be great. So
all right, let's get to it.
Okay,
I'm gonna run.
You run out of time. You've already been talking 22 minutes. Go ahead.
It's ridiculous. Okay, I'm not going to finish, but anyway, one of the things that really took place after World War II was suburbanization. Prolific numbers of automobiles. We have tremendous growth. Now, I just showed you a picture of Scott Therapy, and if you want to know one of the areas where you saw commercial suburbanization, new office buildings, was East Independence Boulevard. I mean, that was all about moving out. And you can see Scott Therapy, who, by the way, was a North Carolina State alumnus. He was, you can see it's that typical unadorned, lots of glass, lots of reinforced concrete, flat roof, and you can see this Independence Tower building that he built or designed, architect of, and it's still there on East Independence Boulevard. He also did the Irvin building, and by the way, I just learned this building has just been declared to go in the National Register. And it was built in 1965. Many of you know it. You see it all the time when you go out East Independence Boulevard. It was built originally, here's a picture of it. It appeared in January 1965. It was the home of Irvin Construction Company. And Irvin Construction Company was a huge builder of neighborhoods, like Westerly Hills. And there's a typical type of house that was put, and that's hardly mid-century modern, very traditional, because most of them were building what they thought people wanted. Here's another one. Look the price: $11,500 to $15,000. homes in Westerly Hills, GIFHA financing, that's VA, same thing. You can see that this was what was marketed, this type of house. But there were some exceptions. Now, Ashley Road, which goes off Wilkinson Boulevard, is the principal street of Westerly Heights. And there is one magnificent building in there. And this is Redeemer Lutheran Church, built in 1957. And my goodness, what a church. I mean, this just breaks everything open. Again, as we're going to see later, steeple is not on top of the church. It's a separate structure. The sanctuary is a separate building. And then you've basically got your support buildings on the detached that come out toward the road. And of course, it's still used as a church. It's an African-American church today, but you know, that you do see examples of mid-century modernism, even in an urban development. The architect for that building was Marion McDowell Brackett, and he was educated at Clemson. And we're going to see people from Auburn and Clemson. I mentioned that Jack Boyd was from Georgia Tech. So it wasn't just Henry Campbell. Modernism was basically you remember what Odell said, to remove the illness of ugliness. So it was in several places. Now, there were some modernist houses built in these suburbs that were developed by the Irwin Company. This is a modernist house, 2626 Sharon Road, built in 1960. You see the typical characteristics, lots of glass, a different kind of roof formation. You can see there's going to be a tremendous amount of light penetrating into this house. We're going to come back to this man, Charles Bates, who worked for Odell Associates, designed this house. But this was in an Irwin development. Another big builder was the John Carlson Company. You might remember they built our house. Now, Clanton Park is off of West Boulevard. And it was another one of these major developments that was built right after World War II. And you can see there, you could buy houses in there, 10.8 to 10.950. And this is so typical. John Carlson advertised this as a modern house with a look of tomorrow. And of course, what they're really talking about there is, again, a very different roof configuration, and also sticking a lot of some big element of glass in there. And this would be what they would characterize as a mid-century modern house. And you find them in neighborhoods. You know, these would be these would be primarily built as spec houses. That is, built for somebody to buy after they're built. This is in Madison Park. This one is in Mountain Brook. And you can see what we're looking at in terms of
wait a minute. I also want to go back for a second, because I saw that it said it was the one on Murray Hill Road. It says it was the 1955 Better Homes and Gardens Home of the Year.
That's right. Well, what they did, Better Homes and Gardens put out plans in their magazine. In other words, and you could use their plans to build a house. Mm-hmm. So there were literally many of these style houses built all over the country. This happened to be one that was built by the developer of Madison Park.
Okay.
And so, you know, and Madison Park Tyvola splits Madison Park. You know, when you go west on Tyvola, you go down to the bottom of the creek, and there's a sewage plant you can sometimes smell. You keep
near
on
the
going
Marion Deal Center.
Marion Deal, you go past the Marion Deal Center, then you go into a neighborhood. That is Madison Park.
Okay.
So, but thanks for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Now here is Jack and Ruth Pettis's house that they built in 1970, again, this would be considered very, very modern. This would be an A-frame house. It was built, by the way, by a man Fritz Schmidt, who worked for Odell and Associates. So houses were definitely being built in different ways. Now, churches. Now, this one, I know people know that this is George Little. Now, Little was North Carolina State School of Design, big architect, did many buildings. We'll show you his own personal house later. And the minister said this soaring church spire should remind men that God challenges them to the loftiest ideals and causes them to look upward. Well, it didn't do that very long because they voted in March 2017 to tear it down and sell the property, and it did get torn down. But many people will recognize this church. This was, of course, right across from South Park. There's that, you go Harris Teeter and shop over in there.
Mm-hmm. I always thought it looks like a ski slope.
Well, that's what everybody says, you know, and that's what everybody says.
Well, it does.
It does, I know. But, you know, clearly this was, and William Little was the architect, and this certainly is mid-century modern. No question about it. And, you know, it's interesting when you look at a church like this. Some love it, some hate it. It evokes strong emotions, but of course, it got torn down. It was demolished in 2018. And I tell you, it was largely because the church could get a lot of money for it, and they saw that as a way to further their mission. And, you know, I'm not going to condemn them for it, but I really, from being someone who likes variety in architecture, I really did enjoy that church. You saw here here's an A-frame church. Again, breaking with that traditional norm. This is Resurrection Lutheran Church. Mm-hmm. Still a very active church, and it was built in 1958. So that's this. Now, you know, I talked about cars, and we've talked about logo architecture before.
Yeah.
Now, this is the Plaza, and I'm going east on the Plaza toward Milton Road, okay? Bing, bing, bop, bop. There it is. Now, that is a terrific example of a mid-century modern logo gasoline station. They were all over the country, and they were known, and they were designed in-house. They were designed in-house. But now here it is. Plaza Road, Phillips 66 service station, built about 1965, 6,000 the Plaza. Architects was Clarence Reinhardt of Phillips Petroleum. These were built all over the country. This is the only one left in Charlotte. And it's a terrific example of mid-century modernism. And these service stations were just part of that whole process of suburbanization that we saw on East Independence Boulevard. And we also saw in all those neighborhoods that I've been going through as well. Now, this was a typical Crown service station. This is at 1926 South Tryon Street. This is essentially in the Wilmore neighborhood. And again, that curved glass, the flat roof, it all speaks of mid-century modernism. So these service stations are important elements in themselves. Now, clearly, one of the things that was a part of this tremendous home building that was going on with FHA and GI loans was lumber. And one of the big lumber companies in Charlotte was H&S Lumber Company. This is Charles Warren Connolly. He's another of these architects. I don't know where he was trained. I don't think he was NC State, but I just don't know. And, you know, you got National Home Week, you know, this is what it was all about. You know, going out and everybody wanted to buy a home, you know,
the American dream.
Baby boomers, American dream. Now, this building's still there. And it's a great example of, it's forlorn. You know, it doesn't have the glory that it had when it was lit up at night and displayed and all the furniture and lumber and all that stuff in there, but it's still there on West Summit Avenue, and it Susan Mayer has identified it as an important element of design. How am I doing time-wise?
35 minutes.
Oh, crap. Excuse me. Excuse me for that. Oh, my gosh. There's no way I can finish. But now another thing was we'll do a little bit at the beginning of the next one with Mid-Century Modern, then we'll go to something else. Another thing people had to do is get financing.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, everything was tied to the automobile, right? Everything was, by the way, you know where the word crap came from?
That guy who invented
Thomas Crapper. Thomas Crapper invented the flush toilet. That's true.
I know.
It's true. It's true. But so I'm sorry it's not a curse word. It has historic reference. I was making reference to Thomas Crapper.
Okay.
Anyway. See what you could do originally? You could drive in, right? And you could walk up there.
Okay.
Yeah, you could drive it in, go up the steps, go in, and get your home financing. Now J.N.P.'s was the architect of this, really J.N.P.'s Jr., because he was but let me tell you what happens to a lot of these mid-modern buildings. They get yucked up. Now it's an enterprise rent-a-car building, and they've closed in where you used to drive your car.
Right. So
and that happens to many of these. Now, here, this is Praise Connor Lee. Now, I could go on and on about Praise Connor Lee. Praise Connor Lee was right there with Murray Wisnett. He was right there under Henry Campeffner. And he was a solid modernist, died very young of a heart attack. But this building is at 2907 Freedom Drive. It's now, doesn't Cricket, isn't that a telephone?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, that building is a mid-century modern building that was initially designed as a former First Citizens branch bank. You can see this kind of masonry, decorative detail, flat roof, lots of glass, typical of that period. Some of them have been turned into a lot of interesting uses. This is another one that Praise Connor Lee did, commercial building. It's now a Dunkin Donuts, although I think Dunkin Donuts has been dumped, hasn't it? And they gone into bankruptcy. I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway, it's at 5133 South Boulevard, done by Praise Connor Lee. And as I say, I'll get to him later. Now, Harold Cooler. I wonder if you know that building. Have you ever seen that building?
On Greenwich Road? No, I don't remember.
You ever seen the building?
Not that
you ever eaten at Shun Lee? You ever eaten?
Of course.
Well, when we go to the Shun Lee from our house going out Randolph Road, we turn left on Greenwich Road.
Oh yeah, I know that.
And if you go past where you turn to go up to Shun Lee, this building's on the left over there.
Yeah, it's near Cotswold Elementary School.
Exactly. So here's another example of mid-century modern office building spreading out to suburbia. Many people don't realize this building was built about 1965. So, it's almost 60 years old, but it's been well maintained, well kept up, so forth. Now, another thing that happened as a result of the post-World War II
All right,
world.
now, do you want to start here next week?
Where are we? How much time?
They're over 38 minutes.
Let me do this real quick.
Okay.
New airport terminal, 1954. Prop planes under construction. Here's the main rating room. Boy, that's mid-century modern. That was kind of like the new railroad station.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine playing an organ anyway? TV, WBTV. Oh man, they started out in the Wilder building, but in 1954, Luther Hodges was the governor. They came and had this big presentation, April 1955, to have the new headquarters building for And now we can stop, because what we're going to do for our final
segment,
Mid-Century Modern, I'm going to show, and it's not going to take but about 10 minutes. It shows some really distinctive houses that were primarily designed by architects as their own homes.
Okay.
And I think you'll find that very refreshing. And I'm sorry I couldn't finish, but
No,
I just
it's
couldn't
fine.
finish.
We just got distracted. We get talking about things, and I do think it's kind of ironic that the mid-century modern movement, their idea was to tear down everything from the past, and now we're trying to save those buildings.
Well, that's right. And I thought your comment about the distinction between Fourth Ward and Second Ward was compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
It was
you
very
should.
compelling.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, as I told you before, Mary Dana, I look upon these things as artifacts.
Yes.
And therefore, these are important because they're an expression of that whole philosophy that came out of places like the North Carolina School of Design. And believe me, the person who designed this house was trained by Henry Campbell.
Yeah, well, you can tell. But right, I think the story of Fourth Ward is an important story, and I hope you'll tell that soon. So, okay, everybody, thanks for being with us today, and we will look forward to seeing you next week when we will wrap up about mid-century modern, and you're going to start talking about fire stations. Is that right, Dad?
Yeah, firefighting, fire equipment, fire stations. The whole history of firefighting. That's
okay. Well, that'll be interesting too. Okay, well, thanks again, and we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye.